If you clicked on this, some part of you already knew. You didn't stumble here. You were brought here. And before I say another word, I want you to notice something. Notice the way your chest feels right now. That tightness. That quiet recognition. Like a name being called from a room you forgot you lived in. I'm going to tell you something that most people are never told. Something that explains the strange ache you've been carrying. Why people you loved are gone. Why the friendships dissolved. Why the rooms you used to fit in suddenly feel 2 sizes too small. You've been calling it loss. You've been calling it loneliness. You've been calling it your own failure. It was none of those things. It was God clearing the table. Let me say that again, slowly, because I need you to hear it the way heaven means it. The people who left your life did not leave by accident. The doors that closed did not close because you weren't good enough to keep them open. Something was being prepared. Something is still being prepared. And you cannot prepare a vessel that's already full. I've sat with people in kitchens across this country. Real people. A man in Ohio who lost his entire circle of friends in the span of a single year and thought God had abandoned him. A widow in Tennessee who couldn't understand why every relationship she leaned on seemed to crumble right when she needed it most. A young mother in Arizona who told me, with tears running down her face, "Why does everyone I trust eventually walk away?" And I told each one of them the same thing I'm about to tell you. What feels like rejection is often relocation. What feels like abandonment is often assignment. Think about that for a second. Really sit with it. Because here's what most people miss. When God is about to do something significant with a life, He doesn't start by adding. He starts by removing. He always has. Open the book anywhere, and you'll see it. The pattern is older than any of us, and it has never once changed. Look at Abraham. Before God could make him the father of nations, He said one word: go. Leave your country. Leave your father's house. Leave the familiar faces and the comfortable streets and everything your identity was built on. God didn't hand Abraham a promise in the middle of his old life. He pulled him out of it first. The promise required an empty hand to hold it. And I want you to feel the weight of that, because it wasn't easy. Abraham wasn't a young man chasing adventure. He was settled. He had roots. He had people. And God asked him to walk away from all of it toward a place he wouldn't even name yet. To a land that I will show you. Not a land I've shown you. A land I will show you. Future tense. Walk first. See later. That's where a lot of you are standing right now. You've been asked to walk, and you haven't been shown where. The people are gone. The certainty is gone, and heaven has stayed quiet about the destination. And in that silence, the enemy whispers that you've been forgotten. You have not been forgotten. You've been positioned. Here's where it gets real. Removal feels like punishment when you're inside it. Nobody experiences subtraction as a blessing in the moment. When the phone stops ringing, when the name disappears from your messages, when the chair at your table sits empty, it doesn't feel like provision. It feels like grief. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you to pretend the grief isn't real. It is real. Jesus wept at a tomb He was about to open. Even when He knew resurrection was 30 seconds away, He still let Himself feel the loss. So feel it. But don't misread it. Let me take you to Joseph, because his story holds something I need you to see. Joseph was the favored son. He had a coat that announced his father's love to the whole family. And then, one afternoon, the very brothers who shared his blood threw him into a pit and sold him to strangers headed for Egypt. Every familiar face, gone. His father, gone. His home, gone. His name, gone. They didn't even call him Joseph in Egypt. He was a slave with a number, a foreigner in a house that wasn't his. Now, here's the part that should rearrange how you see your own losses. Years later, after the prison and the betrayals and the long-forgotten promises, Joseph stands in front of those same brothers. He's not a slave anymore. He's the second most powerful man in the known world. And his brothers are terrified because they remember the pit. They're waiting for revenge. And Joseph looks at them and says something that only makes sense from the other side of the removal. He says, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." The pit wasn't a detour. The pit was the road. The brothers who removed themselves from his life were the very instrument God used to get him into position to save them and to save a nation, and to preserve the very lineage that the Messiah would one day come through. Do you understand what I'm telling you? The removal that broke Joseph's heart was the removal that built the future. And he could not see it in the pit. Nobody can see it in the pit. That's the nature of the pit. It hides the destination. So the question isn't whether you can see where this is going. You can't. None of us can from inside the subtraction. The question is whether you'll trust the hand that's doing the subtracting. Let me tell you why this matters so much, and why it's specifically you watching this, right now, at this exact moment. There's a kind of person who feels everything more deeply than the people around them. You've probably always known you were one of them. You walk into a room and you can feel the temperature of it, the tension, the sadness, the things people aren't saying. You've been told you're too sensitive. You've been told you think too much. You've spent years wondering why you can't just be light and easy like everyone else seems to be. I want to release you from something today. That sensitivity was never a defect. It was equipment. It was God installing the instruments you'd need for the assignment he had in mind before you were ever born. The world calls it a flaw because the world doesn't know what it's for. Heaven calls it a calling. And here's the hard truth that comes with it. People who are built that way cannot grow surrounded by noise. They cannot become who they're meant to be in crowds that drain them. So God, in his mercy, and I mean mercy, even when it doesn't feel like it, begins removing the noise, the relationships that fed on you, the friendships that only flowed one direction, the voices that kept telling you to shrink, the people who loved the smaller version of you and would have resented the fuller one. He doesn't always explain it. He rarely does. He just starts clearing the room. Think about Moses for a moment. 40 years he lived as a prince of Egypt, surrounded by the most powerful people on earth, with every door open to him. And then in a single day it all collapsed, and he ran into the desert, and for 40 more years he watched sheep on the backside of a mountain, with nobody around but his own thoughts and the silence. 40 years of removal. 40 years of, why am I out here? I was meant for more than this. And it was there alone, stripped of every title, every connection, every piece of the identity he'd built, that the bush caught fire and God spoke his name. Not in the palace, not surrounded by the influential, in the emptiness, in the place where everyone he used to know was 1,000 miles away. God does some of his clearest speaking in the rooms he's emptied for that exact purpose. And here's what most people miss. Moses didn't lose 40 years in that desert. He was being made in that desert. The man who walked out to meet Pharaoh was not the man who ran from him. The removal didn't waste him. It refined him. So let me ask you the question that's underneath all of this. What if the loneliness you've been resenting is the very classroom you've been praying for? What if the quiet you've been begging God to fill is the quiet he emptied on purpose, because he's finally got you alone enough to say what he's been wanting to say for years? Now I need to be honest with you about something, because I'd be failing you if I weren't. There came a season in my own life when this stopped being a sermon and became my reality. I won't pretend I understood it while it was happening. I lost relationships I thought were permanent. I watched a version of my life I'd carefully built come apart in my hands. And I did all the things you've probably done. I begged God to put it back. I bargained. I blamed myself. I lay awake doing the math on what I must have done wrong to deserve the emptying. It took me far too long to understand that I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd done something right enough that God decided it was time to start preparing me for what was next. And what was next required space I didn't have. So he made space. And making space hurts. I'm not going to lie to you and say it doesn't. But on the other side of it, I found something I want for you more than I know how to say. I found out who I actually was underneath all the people I'd been performing for. I found a relationship with God that the noise had been crowding out my whole life. And I started to understand the design, the specific reason I was made, the way I was made, the assignment that had been written over me before my first breath. That's actually what led me to put together something I want to tell you about, because I believe with everything in me that some of you watching are exactly where I was, and you need it. There are messages that pass through your eyes, and there are messages that pass through your spirit. If something in you recognized itself while watching, don't dismiss it. That is the Spirit confirming what was already written. The secret protocol carries 7 keys that unveil what heaven deposited in you before you ever arrived. Things no one around you has ever been able to name. It comes with a full audiobook for your moments of prayer, silence, and encounter with God. And you also receive the Awakening Map, the guide that illuminates the 5 seasons of spiritual awakening, revealing with precision exactly where you are and what comes next. The link is pinned in the first comment, but only for a limited time. Don't let this moment pass without a response. I'm telling you about it not as a salesman, but as someone who walked through the desert you might be standing in right now, and who came out the other side carrying a map I wish somebody had handed me at the start. Now let me go back to the thing I most need you to understand, because we're getting to the heart of it. The removal is not the end of the story. The removal is the middle. And the middle is the hardest place to keep your faith, because you're too far from the old life to go back, and too far from the new one to see it. Let me show you Elijah, because his middle nearly killed him. This was a man who'd just seen fire fall from heaven. He'd just watched God show up in the most undeniable way imaginable, in front of hundreds of people. And then, days later, he's sitting alone under a tree in the wilderness, so empty and so isolated that he asks God to let him die. "I've had enough, Lord. Take my life." The prophet who called down fire was now a man who couldn't see the point of living. And watch what God does. He doesn't lecture him. He doesn't shame him for the despair. He feeds him. He lets him sleep. And then he brings him to a cave and tells him to stand at the mouth of it. There's a great wind that tears the mountains apart, but God isn't in the wind. There's an earthquake, but God isn't in the earthquake. There's a fire, but God isn't in the fire. And then comes a still, small voice, a whisper. And that's where God was, the whole time. Here's why that matters to you. When God removes the crowd, he often turns down the volume of his own voice too. Not because he's far, because he's near. He's done shouting over the noise of your old life. Now he's whispering. And a whisper requires you to be close. It requires the room to be quiet. It requires exactly the kind of emptiness you've been resenting. The people had to go so you could hear the whisper. And here's where it gets real, again. Elijah thought he was the only one left. He told God, "I'm the only one. Everyone else is gone." And God corrected him. There were 7,000 others he didn't know about. So even in the deepest part of his isolation, his read on his own situation was wrong. He thought he was alone. He wasn't. He just couldn't see the others from where he was standing. You can't either. From inside the removal, it always looks like you're the only one. It always looks permanent. It always looks like the people who left took the best of your life with them. That's the lie the middle tells. Don't sign your name to it. Let me bring you to David, because his removal came wrapped in something especially cruel. It came disguised as success. David was anointed king as a boy. The prophet Samuel poured oil over his head in front of his whole family. The future was sealed. And then, instead of a throne, David got a cave. He spent years running from a king who wanted him dead, hiding in caves and wilderness, with everything he'd been promised feeling further away every single day. But look at who showed up at that cave. The book says everyone who was in distress, everyone in debt, everyone discontented, they all gathered to him there. The very removal that isolated David from the palace gathered to him the men who'd become his mighty warriors. The cave wasn't exile. The cave was recruitment. God was building David's future army in the exact place that felt like David's lowest point. You don't know who's being drawn to the version of you that's being formed in this season. You don't know what's being built in the cave, but I promise you the cave is not empty of purpose, just because it's empty of the people who used to be there. Now I want to talk about something nobody warns you about, because it's the part that confuses people the most. Sometimes the people God removes are good people. That's what makes it so hard to accept. If everyone who left were toxic, you could file it neatly under, God protected me. But some of them weren't toxic at all. Some of them you loved. Some of them loved you, and they still had to go. Here's the hard wisdom in that. Not everyone who's good for one season is meant for the next one. The friend who walked you through the valley might not be the one meant to climb the mountain with you. The relationship that was exactly right for who you were 5 years ago might be a weight on who you're becoming. God isn't only removing the bad, He's also closing chapters that were good, because a good chapter that refuses to end becomes a prison. Think of Paul and Barnabas. These two were a team. They'd been through everything together: beatings, prison, miracles, the founding of churches. They were closer than most of us will ever be to anyone. And then they had a falling out so sharp that they split and went separate ways. Two of the most faithful men in the early church, and God let them be removed from each other. Why? Because there were two missions now, and two missions need two leaders. The removal didn't shrink the work of God. It doubled it. What looked like a friendship breaking was actually a ministry multiplying. And let me give you one more, because this one's for the ones who feel the removal as a kind of barrenness, like life took something and left an empty space where it used to be. Think of Hannah. Year after year, she went up to the house of God, carrying a grief she couldn't fix. The thing she longed for most had been withheld, and worse, the people around her made sure she felt the lack of it. She was provoked. She was misunderstood. Even the priest, when he first saw her praying with her lips moving and no sound coming out, assumed she was drunk. She was surrounded by people, and not one of them could touch the place where she was hurting. That's its own kind of removal, to be in a crowded room and completely alone in your ache. But watch what the emptiness produced. Out of that long withholding, Hannah prayed a prayer so desperate and so surrendered that when God finally answered it, she gave the answer right back to Him. The son she'd begged for, she handed over to serve in the temple. And that son was Samuel the prophet, who would anoint kings, the voice God used to speak to a whole generation. The very emptiness that broke Hannah's heart was the womb God used to birth a prophet the nation couldn't have lived without. Her barren years weren't God forgetting her. Sometimes the removal lasts as long as it lasts, because God is waiting for you to want the right thing for the right reason. So when you look back at the people who are gone, resist the urge to sort them all into good and bad. Some of them were simply finished. Their chapter in your book had been fully written, and God turned the page. It doesn't dishonor what they meant to you to accept that their part is complete. It honors it. Let me say something now directly to the one who's been blaming themselves. You've been replaying every conversation, wondering what you could have said differently, cataloging your failures, certain that if you'd just been a better friend, a better spouse, a better person, they'd still be here. I know that game. I played it for years. Put it down. Some doors close because you failed. Most doors close because the season ended, and you cannot tell the difference by how much it hurts, because both of them hurt the same. Stop using your pain as evidence of your guilt. The grief you feel is not proof that you did something wrong. It's proof that you loved something real. Those are not the same thing. And here's the freedom in that. If God closed the door, no amount of self-punishment is going to reopen it, and no amount of self-punishment was going to keep it open. You weren't powerful enough to ruin what God was protecting, and you weren't powerful enough to hold shut a door God meant to open. The whole thing was bigger than your performance. That should terrify you a little and free you completely. Now let's talk about what comes after the removal, because that's the part you actually need to walk away with. When God empties a room, He does not leave it empty forever. That's not His pattern. He empties to fill. He subtracts to multiply. He clears the table to set a better one. But, and hear me on this, He fills it on His timeline, not yours. And the gap between the emptying and the filling is the exact place where most people abandon the assignment. Think of the disciples in the upper room after Jesus ascended. He was gone. The teacher they'd left everything to follow had been removed, right up into the sky in front of their eyes. And he told them, before he went, "Don't rush off and start working. Wait. Stay in the room. Don't fill the emptiness with activity. Wait for what I'm sending." So they waited. 10 days in an emptied room, with the most important relationship of their lives newly absent. And on the 10th day, the room that had been emptied of Jesus was filled with the Holy Spirit, and those same frightened men walked out and turned the world upside down. If they'd run out of the room on day 3 to go fill the silence, they'd have missed Pentecost. Some of you are on day 3. The room is empty and you can't stand it, and every impulse in you is screaming to fill it with new people, new noise, anything to make the quiet stop. I'm begging you, don't rush out of the room. What's coming is worth the wait, but it comes to those who can stay in the emptiness long enough to receive it. Here's what I've learned about the chosen, and I use that word carefully, because I don't mean better than anyone. I mean set apart for a particular purpose. The chosen always go through a season of separation before a season of assignment. Every single one in the book did. Joseph in the pit and the prison before the palace. Moses in the desert before the burning bush. David in the cave before the crown. Paul blinded and alone for 3 days before his ministry began. Even Jesus led into the wilderness for 40 days of complete isolation before his public ministry started. The separation is not the curse. The separation is the credential. So if you're in it right now, if you're looking around at a life that has fewer people in it than it used to, and you've been reading that as evidence that something's wrong with you, I want you to read it again. Read it as evidence that something is right. Read it as the fingerprints of a God who's serious enough about your future to disrupt your present. The people God removed were removed because where you're going, they couldn't follow. That's not arrogance. It's the cost of the call. Every person who's ever been used significantly has had to make peace with a smaller circle and a bigger purpose. And let me tell you what's on the other side, because I don't want to leave you in the desert without showing you the promised land. On the other side of this removal is a version of you that you have not met yet. A you that isn't performing for anyone. A you that isn't shrinking to keep the peace. A you that finally knows the specific reason you were made, the assignment that explains every strange ache and every odd gift and every season you couldn't understand while you were in it. The removal is how God carves that person out of the marble of who you used to be. And the people who left, they couldn't have stayed for that. They loved the marble. They couldn't have loved the statue. I told you earlier about the secret protocol, and I bring it up once more, gently, only because I genuinely believe some of you were led here to find exactly that. Those 7 keys are the map I didn't have when I was lost in my own season of removal. And the awakening map will show you which of the 5 seasons you're standing in right now. The link is in the first comment. If your spirit stirred while I was speaking, that stirring was not random. Follow it before this window closes. But whether or not you ever open that link, I need you to leave here holding the one thing that matters most. You were not abandoned. You were not punished. You were not left behind. You were emptied so you could be filled with something the old room never had space for. Now I want to hear from you, and I want you to be specific, because generic comments don't move anything, and your story might be exactly what someone else scrolling tonight needs to read. Tell me about the person God removed from your life that hurt the most, the one you're still tempted to blame yourself for losing. Name what it was. A friendship, a marriage, a whole circle that vanished. And then tell me one thing you've started to see, or are just barely beginning to suspect, that God might have been making room for. Even if you're not sure yet. Even if all you can write is, I don't understand it yet, but I'm choosing to trust the hand that's doing the clearing. Write that down below. Because the moment you put words to it, the removal stops being something that happened to you and starts becoming something God is doing through you. And the room that feels so empty tonight? Stay in it a little longer. The whisper is coming. And this time, there's no noise left to drown it out.